Hello and welcome to the Pharma Forum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. The costs associated with clinical trials are a major bottleneck to drug development and affordability. And although clinical trials are in a massive period of innovation, it's not always clear that those innovations are having an effect on cost. A new preprint study from the Digital Medicine Society shows that using digital endpoints like sensor data in drug and device trials can reduce trial sizes and durations and potentially save tens of millions of dollars. My guest today to talk about this research is DiME CEO Jennifer Goldsack, who has joined us on the podcast a few times before. Welcome back to the show, Jennifer.
It's always a pleasure to be here with you, Jonah. Thank you so much for having me.
Maybe just to kind of set the stage here a little bit, why did you guys decide to do this work, and why is it kind of important for the larger project that DiME is involved in?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, I want to shout out our partners at Tufts, at J&J, at Genentech Roche, at UCB, Bayer, Takeda, and MindMed. It was a really tremendous group that came together. And to answer your question, why did we want to interrogate the ROI on digital endpoints now? There's an argument that, is this even necessary given their sort of huge increase in adoption? If we look at DiME's library of digital endpoints, for example, we can see that in the fall of 2019, there were 12 industry players who were using 34 digital endpoints. But today we see over 420 sort of digital endpoints being used by industry. Is it not safe to assume that, the adoption is there, the value proposition is clearly articulated, so on and so forth? And what we actually learned, Jonah, from sort of listening carefully to our industry colleagues is, in a vastly different market than we've experienced over recent years, and with continued pressures on costs in medical product development, it is actually more important now than ever to demonstrate that the ongoing investments being made in digital endpoints are actually returning, one, commercially, and two, to the patients that ultimately we're all here to serve.
So very briefly, what did the study show? What can we kind of conclude, and what maybe can we not yet conclude because we didn't have enough data, or we didn't ask the right questions?
So I'm confident we asked the right questions, but there's definitely more we can do. We were bullish about the data that we would find. As you know, Jonah, at DiME, we've always been really enthusiastic about the value that digital endpoints will return. But I will say we were blown away by the findings. So there's really two top line findings that sort of folks listening in, I think, will be interested in. The first relates to timelines. And we were able to demonstrate, and I'm happy to talk about the methodology if you're interested, but we were able to demonstrate that when you use a digital endpoint in a clinical trial, there's substantial reductions in timelines. Overall, by nearly 8 or 9 months for the duration of the development and evaluation of a new molecule. But if we break that out into sort of phase 2 and phase 3, that we can save up to 4 months for phase 2 studies and up to 5 for phase 3 studies. If we think about costs, if we think about time to market, those reductions are substantial, and it's a faster pathway to revenue. So great value associated with the timelines. But the finding that really, I think, is going to be sort of compelling as it relates to supporting arguments for ongoing investment in the development and deployment of digital endpoints is going to be the ROI that we calculated using estimated net present value. And so what we were able to see is that over the course of a trial, we're seeing 4 to 7 times return on investment from that initial outlay that folks are putting in order to include digital endpoints. So in terms of real money terms, in phase 2, we are seeing $2 to $3 million of return of investment. And when we move to phase 3 clinical trials, Jonah, we're seeing $25 to $48 million in terms of a return on investment, in terms of cost savings when it comes to the way that we're able to design, the way that we're able to deploy clinical trials when we make the decision to leverage a digital endpoint.
So what is it about digital endpoints that allows you to truncate these timelines and also the trial sizes? I mean, spin that out for me a little bit in terms of how the cause and effect works.
Yeah, of course. So let's think about what a traditional sort of study schedule might look like. And it might be sort of 12 visits to the clinic where you will come in and you will have a series of sort of measurements taken. They are all snapshot pieces of data over the course of a clinical trial. when we start relying on the use of sort of remote sensor-based products in order to capture digital endpoints, there's substantial impacts in a variety of different ways. So first of all, let's say if you could reduce that sort of study schedule from 12 visits to 6 visits, and you make it a sort of hybrid trial because you don't need to come in for every sort of assessment and measurement, you're going to recruit much more quickly. By definition, it is a lower burden trial. You may be able to travel further if you are a participant in order to take part in the trial. This allows us to compress sort of recruitment timelines and to maintain sort of retention levels that accelerate timelines. The other piece, and this is where I think it starts to get really impactful and where we're seeing an awful lot of the sort of time savings and the cost savings, is when we are using these digital tools, we are capturing much higher resolution data. So instead of relying on 12 individual snapshots, for example, we actually have, in some cases, up to a continuous evaluation of how a patient is feeling, functioning, and surviving that is much better informed and that will allow us to make much better or draw much sort of stronger conclusions earlier on. So it's the density of that data, that resolution of the data that actually allows us to say we can infer much more information from a single patient and we can do it more quickly. And that will allow us to collapse both timelines and sample size of a clinical trial. And that's where we're seeing so much of these time savings. And I think the final piece that is particularly important and particularly interesting, and that we haven't yet interrogated in the data that we published in the preprint, but that at the Digital Medicine Society we are going to be immediately pursuing in future work, is there's also a lot of value in the new information that we can capture using digital endpoints. So all of the value that we've codified in the published preprint relates to the digitization largely of existing measures. But when we think about the fact that we can now capture information about someone's sort of performance in the presence and the absence of a novel therapy, we can actually probe impacts on their lives that we've never been able to interrogate before. We can think about the value of this to clinical decision making, first by the scientists on the clinical trial, and then downstream by our regulatory colleagues, and then by our payer colleagues, as they think about, gosh, we can define the impact and the value of this new drug on a patient's lives in ways we haven't been able to before. And our hope is, and our expectation is, that that will affect pricing and reimbursement decisions. So it's not just the upstream cost savings during R&D, but that actually additional value will be returned once the product is commercialized. Most important, through outsized impact on the lives of patients, but second, a willingness from sort of payers to actually reimburse for certainty about the impact of these new medical products on patients' lives, because we can measure it in ways we've never been able to with these digital endpoints.
Reading the study, it really felt like it's actually like quite transparent about the limitations and quite kind of conservative about the claims it's making. But it feels like maybe the weakest leg of the stool here is actually the number for the cost of the intervention, the cost of the digital endpoints, which you need in order to sort of make an ROI claim. But it sounds like there was kind of some difficulty really coming up with a robust average to use for that cost. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. And in news that will surprise none of your listeners, unfortunately, no one is posting all of their costs and all of their sort of downstream cost savings in public forums. So it is not the easiest information to scrape. But I do think that we did a good job. And then to your point, once we had sort of some ranges and estimates, we did hold ourselves highly accountable to some of the uncertainty around the underlying data by tethering to the most conservative end of the estimates. But maybe, Jonah, what I'll do is I'll start by sort of describing the methodology that we had associated with the study, and then talk about how that allows us to draw a certain level of confidence in the results that we have published. So the first thing we did was we actually went to DiME's library of digital endpoints, Jonah, and we said, can we look at some key therapeutic areas, cardiovascular, diabetes, CNS, where we know that there's a high utilization of these digital endpoints? And then can we look at these trials that have relied upon a digital endpoint to answer questions about the safety and efficacy of a new medical product in these therapeutic areas? And then we can we go to the clinicaltrials.gov database and find essentially matched trials that did not rely upon a digital endpoint? And can we do, from sort of publicly available literature, a comparison of things like recruitment timelines, sample, like study size, the likelihood of actually completing the trial, for example, successfully, and getting a question about the performance of the drug, rather than what we see far too often, which is, trials collapsing due to inability to recruit. So we did a comparative analysis based on sort of matched trials that we were able to find. And that gave us a lot of insight into sort of the timelines, the sample sizes, and some elements of cost drivers. But you cannot calculate return on investment unless you know what the investment is. So that's where sort of our colleagues were able to rally around not only their relationships, but frankly, our tremendous network of experts that we have at DiME, Jonah. And we actually put out a survey. We were very, very careful with how we use the data. Only DiME and Tufts ever saw the sort of investment data that both, one, pharma companies are making, and two, digital measurement product sort of developers are making in developing and evaluating and then preparing to deploy these digital endpoints for use in clinical trials. So we were able to leverage our network, and we did some direct information gathering in order to assess the initial sort of bolus of investment that's necessary. And then we were able to look at what's the return that we're expecting using only what we could find through clinicaltrials.gov. So it did not contemplate, for example, the fact that those revenue streams would come sooner. It did not contemplate that maybe pricing and reimbursement decisions would be more favorable because we're using more meaningful measures. And yet we still saw that estimated net present value sort of suggest to us that there's ROI of up to sort of 4 to 7 times of that initial investment. The one other thing I would say, and this gets back to your question about, look, we recognize that there's some limitations here, and we think those limitations make these estimates more conservative than perhaps they are in reality, which is the initial investment that you have to make to develop and deploy a digital endpoint within a particular pipeline is particularly high. Figuring out what good operations look like requires higher investments the first time. Developing and then sort of evaluating an endpoint for the first study is a very high fixed cost. If you wanted to translate that endpoint into a similar sort of therapeutic area or into an aligned patient population and reuse it, those costs are vastly reduced. And yet we were only evaluating that initial outlay. So long story longer, I think the rigor of the work was incredible. There were certainly some limitations based on access to data. And as we drew our conclusions, we recognized those limitations through more conservative estimates rather than being too bullish and perhaps misrepresenting the opportunity that we feel so strongly is on the table for those innovators, for those medical product developers who are committed to their digital strategy.
Something else occurred to me as you were explaining that sort of one-to-one between clinicaltrials.gov and your library. Obviously, every trial has to be in the clinical trials registry. How are trials sort of selected to be in the library? I mean, is it opt-in?
That's a really good question. In order to ensure that it's as comprehensive as possible, we have 2 ways that we maintain and update the library, which is a quarterly activity here at DiME. So first of all, we do get sort of a pretty high velocity of submissions from industry. When we get a submission, it will only make its way into the library if there are publicly available records of the claims that they are making as they sort of propose endpoints for the library. So if, for example, it's not listed on clinicaltrials.gov or in another registry, we are not going to accept it. We are also looking for other things like scientific publications, so on and so forth. So we know that anyone coming to use the open access library can be absolutely confident in the quality of the information that they are able to pull. There are certainly some others who have put sort of digital endpoint libraries behind paywalls, for example, and will include in those libraries unpublished trials, those that aren't sort of publicly listed in a registry. But we've decided not to go that route with our endpoints library. So that's one way. Folks can submit something and then we make sure that we have triangulate the information that they are providing us. The second thing we do, Jonah, and this is really our commitment to this resource being as valuable as possible to the field, our team actually also goes in and using a priori and consistently applied protocol, scrapes clinicaltrials.gov quarterly. So we go through all new trial submissions and then we pass out, tease out, and then list in our endpoints library any trial that is purporting to use a sensor-derived digital endpoint. So we are very confident in the completeness of the digital endpoints library wherever there is publicly available information to support its use.
That's great. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for, because the you probably saw where I was going with that. Doing a one-to-one comparison between a directory of people who volunteered the information and a directory you're required to be in might create a little bit of an issue. But it sounds
100%. We did not take the cream of the crop from one and then sort of compare it with the average in another. And I actually, shout out to our team here at DiME. It is not the most fun process that the team engages in once a quarter to go through and scrape all of that information. But it is something that we are committed to, and it makes us absolutely confident that the quality, the completeness, and integrity of that library is where it needs to be. And for anyone who is interested, the Digital Endpoints Library is open access. It is on the DiME website, and not only do folks have access to the library that which functions as a database, so they can toggle, they can search, they can do all sorts of things. We also publicly post the methodology and the inclusion-exclusion criteria that we have for the library. So if this has piqued anyone's interest and they want to learn more, Jonah, that's all available open access per our sort of values here at DiME.
I had to do something quite similar to that manually when I was a reporter at Moby Health News, looking for scoops. And I can certainly sympathize.
Well, and this is what our team is willing to do for the community. When I look at, for example, sort of Jonah, the web traffic, right, which is a nice sort of measure of how often these sort of tools and products are being accessed. Our endpoints library consistently month on month is always one of our most highest access resources here at DiME, and that really was one of the drivers for the study that we've been discussing today. The ability to say, not only is there a lot of activity around digital endpoints in the market, but they are driving impact. And they are driving impact in terms of commercial return, which, we've got to be comfortable with the fact that this is a commercial industry. And if we can't show that, we are not actually going to be able to use these tools to position ourselves to do ongoing R&D for new medical products to improve the lives of patients. So being able to show that was critically important. And I think especially in this transition period around the digitization of healthcare, clinical research, it's not enough to talk about the potential of these sort of innovations and investments anymore. We actually have to show hard proof points. So I'm really proud of the fact that we were able to bring that home in the publication that's now available in preprint. And I think for anyone who's interested in seeing sort of really some of the rigor behind these conservative estimates, they can go to that preprint. And obviously, at the speed of science, that will be sort of published in peer review, hopefully soon. And then second, in the same way that we have the commitment at DiME to our digital endpoints library, we have a commitment to all of our partners in industry, whether that's folks who are sort of developing digital measurement products that are used to generate data for endpoints, whether it's investors in those products, or whether it's the life sciences industry themselves who are telling us we need to be able to better crosswalk the value of these investments to the strategic goals of our organization in order to continue to garner ongoing executive investment and support. We're listening, we're reacting to that. Jonah, we're actually launching a new project in the next probably 6 weeks to 2 months here at DiME that will sort of come up with a suite of resources that not only allow people to benchmark their performance to date based on their investments in digital endpoints, but we will also sort of release some additional tools and resources, for example, a sort of market opportunity calculator, an ROI calculator, where a priori, if you are trying to make a decision about whether it's worth including a digital endpoint from a sort of strategic standpoint, we can actually model that out for you. That is what we're going to be building over the next 6 to 8 months, standing on the shoulders of the work we did with our colleagues at Tufts, at J&J, at Genentech Roche, at UCB, at Bayer, at Takeda, at MindMed. This can't be the end of the road, but it's certainly a strong and compelling signal that the value is there. And we need to have the discipline just to quantify it a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think one of many things that's particularly compelling about this work, besides the sort of the rigor of it and the transparency, is the fact that it is coming from, you know, from this kind of more neutral group, right? It's not you're not making the sensors, you're not selling the sensors, and you're working with academia and you're working with pharma to really kind of give people confidence in these results, right?
100%. I mean, Jonah, you've sort of followed our work for long enough to know that, our secret sauce here at DiME is to say, in order to better serve patients, which is ultimately the goal of our industry, we need to partner with industry in order to support industry so that across the board we can be making gains through the digitization of clinical research and healthcare. We can't just, we're not a consultancy, although there's certainly, a lot of room for that kind of activity to go one by one. We want to be the rising tide that lifts all ships. And I feel very strongly that these initial data, these substantial sort of dollar figures that we're able to demonstrate from ROI following the use of a digital endpoint in clinical trials is going to be a really good shot in the arm to give people confidence in their digital strategies. And then as we can refine the way that we evaluate and calculate sort of return on investment going beyond dollars to a variety of different strategies that different organizations might have. And we actually give people tools in the sort of public domain to be able to calculate what prospective ROI might be. That's good for everyone. That's good for the developers of the products. That's good for the sort of the scientists who are relying upon them, the commercial entities they sit within. And when we get that right, it also returns to patients. So that's always how we think about our positioning and our activities here at DiME.
You mentioned earlier that, this doesn't even really get into some of the benefits of digital endpoints on top of. This is kind of a study that says, hey, what you're doing now, this lets you do it better. But it also lets you do other things. And that's sort of like the icing on top. But also, this is the necessary step, is to establish that, that switching to digital endpoints, using digital endpoints is gonna make things easier, not gonna make things harder. And then you can start talking about the benefits on top, right?
100%. And you articulate that really nicely, Jonah. And one of the things we always think about at DiME, because while I am very proud of our mission to advance the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital technologies to redefine healthcare and improve lives in a healthcare and clinical research environment that is a commercial endeavor, we are naive if we think we are going to move the needle at all without being able to demonstrate a double bottom line. And I think one of the things we come back to time and time again when it comes to the use of digital tools in medical product development is we can both improve the patient experience, whether for individuals participating in the trials or folks benefiting from medical products once they are sort of on the market because they are addressing the most important symptoms, which we've never been able to manage before, that we can do all of that. We can improve, we can make clinical trials more inclusive, so we can make more generalizable sort of conclusions about what drugs work for all of the patients we're here to serve. And we can make this make more commercial sense. And right now, where we find ourselves in the clinical sort of research ecosystem, where it is not the market that it was before, we see high rates of technical failures. We're seeing a lot of big pharma go off sort of patent cliffs. It makes it harder to think about reinvesting in the new pipeline. We're struggling to recruit. We have to be able to make a commercial argument in addition to the patient argument, in addition to the diversity, equity, and inclusion argument, or we're not going to make forward progress. And I'm just thrilled that we've been able to do that with this study so that we can keep throwing coal on the fire in order to be able to maintain investment for the betterment of patients, because we can show that it makes good business sense too.
Are we at a point where there are digital endpoints and digital sensors to benefit every drug trial? Or are we still at a point where, there's going to be somewhere it makes sense and somewhere there's not a tech there yet? I know that your library has a vast kind of array of endpoints for different sorts of things.
It's a really good question. And I think it's really important that I preface my response by saying neither here at DiME nor I think anywhere across industry should we be behaving as tech determinists, where we are here with our sensor tools and technologies, and our expectation is that everything is digitized and it sort of supersedes every other sort of, clinical measure that we have relied upon successfully for decades now in sort of clinical trials. That said, we're proving right now with this study and with a variety of other bodies of work that there is value associated with the use of these measures. When we interrogate the endpoints library, we can see, for example, the 3 therapeutic areas that we picked in this study, cardiovascular, diabetes, sort of CNS, that we are seeing broad utilization of these measures. I think that the root cause for why there has been different pace of adoption across different therapeutic areas is not just about the presence or absence of a sensor-based technology. So, for example, one of the things I've heard numerous times from our colleagues in industry is that 9 times out of 10, if you're trying to conduct a decentralized clinical trial, it's actually not the remote patient monitoring and the digital endpoints that is the limiting factor. It's things like being able to do remote sort of blood draws and have the samples arrive uncoagulated. It's like simple, basic things that are the bottleneck here. And until we can do things like make sure that every blood sample arrives uncoagulated from a decentralized clinical trial, there's a good argument that there's no point investing in the digital endpoints, because you're still going to be pulling people for those sorts of studies into the clinic to do some of the other sorts of assessment that cannot be sort of replaced by a digital endpoint. Similarly, we see more complex conditions, and I think sort of cancer and oncology research is the best example, where the complexity of the trial, the need to collect other data like imaging, like blood work, requires the patient to come to the site anyway. So again, we haven't seen that level of investment in digital endpoints. I also think that's really an important call to action for all of us to move away from a narrow notion of digital measures being used only as endpoints. While that has been the focus of this study, while that is the focus of our library of digital endpoints, if we take the example of oncology, there's an awful lot I think these sensor-based measures can do for us to make trials more accessible, to reduce costs, to have better outcomes, if we are to start to think about using these measures as ways that we can monitor performance status outside of the clinic. So if, for example, someone on a new medical product starts to decompensate, that we can actually administer supportive treatment in time to keep them on the investigational therapy that, 1, might save their life, and 2, prevents them from being a dropout statistic in the clinical trial because we had to switch therapies. These are the sorts of things that digital measures can use. We also at DiME are running a project looking at the use of sensor-based technologies to give us early warning signals for cytokine release syndrome as we are developing new immuno-oncology products. Typically, you have to do an inpatient study if you're going to develop a new IO therapy. That is incredibly costly. It also means that it's incredibly difficult for patients with cancer to access those trials, because even if that trial might save your life, the reality is if you've got 3 kids at home and you are a single parent, you are not going into an inpatient study because you cannot leave your family. And the reason it's inpatient is so we can monitor for the risk of CRS. What if we could monitor for that using these tools and a risk prediction engine outside the walls of the clinic? You think about how that would reduce costs, think how that would improve access and outcomes. All of these things are possible, and it requires us looking not only at the value of digital sensors as digital endpoints, but also as sort of digital drug development tools across the spectrum and across the clinical trials lifecycle.
I was actually going to bring up CRS. JDev from Biopharmas was telling me about that very thing last year at ASCO. I think he was using it as an example of sort of how AI also is
100%. 100%, because if we want to develop, and as I said, this is something we're working on with tremendous partners here within our digital health measurement collaborative community at DiME, it is not going to be a single sensor generated measure that gives us that early warning signal for cytokine release syndrome. It is going to be tools like, we're going to be monitoring for early signals of fever, of headache, of pressure, all of these different sorts of things. We're currently working on sort of the basket of measures that we want to interrogate. But once we have those streams of data, it will be artificial intelligence. It will be the use of complex algorithms to be able to balance those signals in such a way that we can train a model to function as an early warning system. So there are two things that are exciting. One, that we're actually starting to see hard dollars and commercial value associated with the use of even sort of simple real-time monitoring tools as digital endpoints. And that simultaneously, the technology and our confidence in it and our analytic capabilities have matured to the point where we can actually go after these more ambitious targets. It's a very exciting time. And while there is a lot of work to do, there are still plenty of kinks to iron out. There's good data, Jonah, that this is working and that this is returning both to industry and the patients that we're here to serve.
So last few minutes, Jen, anything we haven't talked about yet that you want to highlight, either about the study or more broadly about the work you guys are doing?
I feel like we've covered a lot. I think the main takeaway here would be the promise of digital measures, whether through some of the more novel applications as digital drug development tools that we've just been discussing, or as digital endpoints and the findings from the sort of publication that we've also sort of spoken about today, Jonah. It's at this point hard, compelling, and consistent evidence that the ROI is there, that there is value in doing this work. And I think that should come as, perhaps to some a relief and to others as incredibly motivating, that there are new scientific and technical pathways that we can take in the way that we develop new medical products such that they are more accessible, they do a better job of addressing the most important symptoms to patients, and that they are offering a pathway for what feels on some days like an unsustainable R&D environment to something that truly is sustainable over time, that we can develop new therapies in a way that is streamlined and that is proving to be effective. That is, I think, exciting, and our commitment to continuing to play that out for the field, to deliver that data and to deliver those tools so that individual organizations can also calculate ROI. That is that body of work that we are launching in the next sort of 6 weeks or so. If anyone listening in wants to join us at the table to really help contribute to that work and get those data firsthand, certainly reach out to us through the DiME website. Let us know. We'll get you plugged into that work. It's an exceptional collaborative that's coming together, and it stands on the shoulders of the great work that we've already done in this space.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. Really, really interesting stuff. I will, of course, include a link to the preprint in the show notes so people can dig into it themselves. Yeah, look forward to seeing where this goes next.
Terrific. Jonah, always great to chat. Terrific questions, and appreciate you as always.
That concludes this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at Pharma Forum. Thanks for listening.